Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Libby Sartain, and I'll be leading our panel today on executive retention, which is a critical issue to many of our compensation committees that we're dealing with on a regular basis. I am joined today by two experts on the panel, both from Pearl Meyer. First, we have Greg Steckel, who is focused on executive compensation, and Susan Sandlund, an organizational psychologist and head of the firm's leadership practice. We're going to approach the topic from both perspectives, being long-term executive retention, which involves both pay and paying attention to individuals and their particular career paths. And we will start with a conversation about just how expensive unwanted executive turnover can be financially, strategically, and culturally. But before we begin, Mary Gonzalez with NACD has a few housekeeping items to note, and then Greg will kick off our program. Mary?
Great. Thank you very much, Libby. Can we move over a couple of slides? All right. So as always, everyone, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available early next week, both on nacdonline.org/webinars and on the Pearl Meyer website that you see here. I have just a few administrative announcements before we get started. First, I'll talk about the tools that are available to you during this webinar. First, on the bottom of the page, you'll see all of the information about today's panelists and access their bios. I'd also like to highlight those additional resources that we have. You can access the additional resources on the tab on your navigation bar at the top of your screen. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can download a copy of today's slide deck and access additional resources, or access it on the URL that you see on the screen here as well. We'd like this event to be as interactive as possible, so we do have poll questions, and when those come up, you'll see them pop up on your screen. We also have a Q&A icon to the right of the screen. Please feel free during the entire session to submit your Q&A sessions. We've allotted a little bit of time at the end to be able to answer as many questions as possible, time permitting. And for those questions that we can't get answered, we'll have someone from the Pearl Meyer team be able to answer you afterwards. Next slide. So your participation in today's live webinar earns you credit towards maintaining your NACD credential, whether that's through NACD Fellows or through your Certified Directors program, and you'll automatically receive 1 credit for your participation. Please note that you must attend this webinar for at least 50 minutes in order to receive your credit. And speaking about our NACD Director Certification Program, if you are interested and you want to set yourself apart as a high-performance director, this designation is a wonderful way of doing that. So check out our webpage or contact your membership advisor at credentialing@nacdonline.org. Finally, as always, we have a few evaluation questions in the end, and so those will pop up on your screen after the webinar, and they'll also be in a follow-up email from this program that's happening around 3 p.m. Eastern time today. We'd really appreciate your feedback. It's the only way of us letting us know how we can improve these webinars for you. And with that, that's all the housekeeping I have today. I'd like to turn that over to our friends at Pearl Meyer, who will get us started. Greg?
Thank you, Mari. Let me just do a quick overview of our agenda today. So first topic, we're going to talk about the executive retention imperative, right? So this is, why are we talking about this today? So we're going to talk about a few things there. We're going to move from there into what we're saying is the problem with traditional approaches to executive retention. So what's not working with traditional approaches. The third thing we're going to offer up is sort of a more holistic approach to addressing executive retention. And then we're going to dive into some of the real levers that compensation committees have at their disposal to really attack the issue of executive turnover and improve executive retention. And then, of course, as always, we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. We turn now to sort of this first section on the retention imperative. And, the basic point here is that turnover, undesirable executive turnover, is expensive. I'll cover a few of the direct costs. I'll have Susan talk for a minute about some of the indirect costs. But as we know, when we have turnover, especially when we have to look outside the organization to fill those roles, you're talking about search fees. You might have higher external market pay than you had internally. You've got the potential for buyout and inducement awards. A lot of times executives on the way in are negotiating first-year guarantees. You might have relocation. So, there are some hard dollar costs to think about with regard to undesirable executive turnover. Susan, what about the indirect costs there?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, whenever you lose a key executive at the top, if they're someone that everyone values, it really hits an organization hard. And you have to not only fill that role once again, but it affects the culture. So it sends a message. Why did that person leave? What did they not like about the organization? So it, of course, affects performance as well. If that person was in a critical role, who do we have to cover that space? Do we have enough bench strength underneath that person to make sure we can fill the void? But no one desires this. It's the last thing you want to have happen at the top.
Susan and Greg, are you seeing unexpected turnover in this post-COVID high inflation world? Are people leaving for reasons they didn't leave for before?
Yeah, I'll start. I think that the absolute level of turnover is about the same, but the reasons for the turnover are different in post-COVID world that we're living in. I think people are just rethinking work in general. They're rethinking their relationship to work, and it is causing some, especially in the CEO job, some more limited tenure than we've seen in a long time. You only want to do the job for a shorter period of time, and then so boards and comp committees in particular really have to be ready for managing that succession process.
It seems to be about quality of life more than compensation a little bit.
That's exactly right. That's why, again, we're going to talk about why traditional approaches may not be working well. That's one of the key aspects of this, is that because turnover is being driven by different factors in today's world, traditional solutions around just compensation might be too limited. Okay, so let's talk about, so we're already talking about it, sort of the problem with traditional approaches on the next page. Again, I think as a compensation committee, when you think about retention, you might immediately go to compensation because that's been the historical focus of compensation committees. So part of that sort of assumes that the reason you're having some undesirable executive turnover is because of things that are really on the surface. And usually those things that are on the surface, you're assuming are compensation related. Either I don't make enough money here, or somebody's willing to offer me more money. And so the traditional solutions to retention tend to be things like retention bonuses and special equity grants with, cliff vesting after 3, 4, 5 years. So, those immediate sort of knee-jerk reactions to say, what do we do to try to enhance retention? It's usually these supplemental compensation plans. And there's really two issues with those. One is they're reactive, right? Usually you're only in that world if somebody has already got a foot or foot and a half out the door. And two, it is based on a pretty big assumption that the issue that you're trying to address is a compensation issue. And I'm going to have Susan here in a minute just talk about some of the things that are sort of below the surface that could be cues that you are heading to a potential retention issue or turnover problem.
Absolutely. Well, here's the thing. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a top executive leave just because of money. And when we look at, what are the real reasons people leave? If we want to move to the next page, please. Oops. We're really looking at some leadership levers, so if I had to say, is it money? That's always a factor. But to be fair, it's all about how do you feel you're being valued at the top? What kind of culture is there at the top? And to what degree has the company really invested in you as an executive? So those are usually reasons why we're seeing people actually decide to leave. It isn't often that I see it because of compensation.
Yeah, and again, we're going to talk here about this more holistic model here on this page that says, it kind of goes back to that adage, if you have a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail, right? And so as a compensation committee, again, no surprise that you tend to think about compensation as being the problem and therefore compensation being the solution. And in this more holistic view of how to improve retention or avoid turnover, you can see that compensation is a central component, but it's broader than that. So compensation clearly has a role to play in reducing turnover and enhancing executive retention. But as Susan mentioned, so does certain things around leadership, right? How we hire people, how we develop people, how we manage their careers, coaching, succession planning, all of those things can enhance the retention of key executives. And then also downstream from compensation around communication, really, because again, we'll spend a little bit of time at the end of this session talking about some communication strategies that can really enhance retention. And we just don't want any of these things to get lost in the shuffle in terms of possible things that would be in the solution set for a compensation committee to address what could be this problem of ensuring executive retention. But before we dive into that, we do want to ask a few polling questions. And it's a little unusual. We're going to do two back to back here, but we go to the first one. Here, we're just asking, the fundamental question of how important is executive retention to your organization's long-term success. So we're really only giving you three choices here. We're going to say, critical, important, or potentially not important. And so take a minute, if you would, and just respond to this question. And then once we get the results, we'll move into a related immediate second polling question. And Susan, I want to go back to your point about, the impact on culture. I see it all the time when a person, or heaven forbid, two people on the leadership team leave. I mean, it can be hard to not have that have a detrimental impact on the company's culture.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, though, there are different situations. Let's say you have a new CEO. So you'll see turnover often in the senior team. And some of that is to be expected and frankly desirable. So some of it is good turnover. But there are, when you have a situation where a number of people are leaving and it's unclear what's going on. I mean, as a board member, this is always when our antenna need to be up, and we need to be asking the right questions and thinking about, what's really going on here, because this is part of our critical role as a board member to ensure that we have the right talent at the top and to be able to read, is there a culture problem here? Is there a CEO problem here? I mean, those are all issues that could impact whether executives around the table want to stick around or not.
I think it's also important, when you're in the comp committee, and I'm the head of a comp committee, to have discussions about individual executives, because it's not one size fits all when you're dealing with the CEO or top executive, and what will keep that person in the seat and feeling good. And I think sometimes just asking, I know I asked our CEO the last compensation review, what are you thinking of? What's important to you? And we responded appropriately. And he really appreciated that and let me know. And I think sometimes comp committees are hesitant to do that, but it's important.
Absolutely. Looks like we've got some results, and thank goodness. This was always risky. If everybody said not important at all, then we'd lose you for the rest of the session. But we have 74% of respondents that are saying that this is a critical issue for long-term success, and then 26% in the middle. Nobody said not important. So we've got the right crowd here for today's topic for sure. Our next question is to ask you to sort of weigh in at the beginning of this session as to, we've presented this more holistic view of how to tackle a turnover problem or enhance retention. We said there could be some leadership elements to the solution. There could be some compensation elements to the solution. There could be some communication things that you could be doing. So right now, before we dive into all of the levers that are at your disposal, what would you say would have the most important impact on retention? Is it leadership? Is it compensation? Or is it communication? And the fun bit here is that we're going to ask this exact same question at the end of the session to see if we've changed any minds. And again, Libby, I think with the expanding role of compensation committees, and we've got, compensation and talent committees, compensation and human capital committees, I think there's a really new and emerging, I would say, practice of really thinking beyond compensation on just about any issue that comes before the comp committee.
Exactly. I know my boards are having a lot more conversation about what keeps our executive happy and and whether or not we can do anything to accommodate or make it better, make their lives better.
Absolutely. It's as the agenda of the comp committee gets broadened, you take on these bigger issues around culture, around our, how are our executives being retained? You also have to think about the expertise around the comp committee table. Like, are we equipped to deal with this? And when do we raise our hand and say we need help? Because some of these issues are pretty tricky, and you have to know how to stay ahead of them, actually. I mean, if you're never hearing your CEO talk about retention, if you're never, if you're not hearing culture being discussed, things like that, that to me sometimes is a little bit of a warning sign of, hey, they don't seem to be looking at this at all.
I think we're still waiting for results to come in here. See if we can get some. Okay, we've got some results. Okay, this is great. So not too much heat on me today. Compensation got an 11% of the audience saying that that's probably going to have the biggest impact. And leadership leads the group with 68% of people saying these are probably some levers that are going to have the biggest impact on retention. So that's a perfect segue into our next section, where we're going to really dive into some of those details around leadership strategies focused on executive retention.
Okay. Let's move forward. So, I mean, this is no surprise, but culture is a huge, huge reason why people stick around in any company. And you may think it's, oh, that's lower down. No, it's at the top. I mean, if the culture isn't right, if tone at the top isn't right, your best executives will move on. That's just a fact. And so this is so important for a committee, for the full board to really understand, like, what is the tone at the top? What is the culture? And we know the CEO is the one who initially helped set this tone at the top, but how does this team operate? And you can look around and see, how do they interact? Do they feel comfortable when they're in the room with the board, with the comp committee? Do they seem to be interacting as if they're a real team? Is there a fear factor? I mean, sometimes you can sense, ooh, there's a fear factor here. People don't want to speak up, or when you have a CEO who doesn't really allow their team to speak up. I mean, that's a little bit of a telltale sign to watch out for, as far as could there be an issue with culture and tone at the top. But when you have a wonderful culture, it. They talk about it. It's an exciting place to work. This is what keeps people, the connection, the purpose of what they're doing. All of these things roll into, the underlying values that form the culture. So for board members, for committee members to understand, well, do I have my, my hand on the pulse here of the culture? And do I understand how it impacts performance here? Is it a positive culture? Is it holding people tight to the company? Does it make them want to show up? Super important.
Another thing for boards to talk about, Susan, I think, is the culture of the board itself, and how the board's culture can positively influence the culture inside the company and drive it forward in a good way.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're setting the tone too, because especially if you feel there's a need for there to be a culture shift in the company. I mean, obviously it's not the board's call to make that happen. It's the management team's call, but if it's warranted, the board can help set the tone of what that might look like and start the ball rolling, really. But it's a big deal. I mean, this is one of these, you know it when you see it. You also, if you dig as a board member to find out what is the culture, if it's a if it's a toxic culture, or if it's, if there are reasons why this is not a fun and exciting place to work, it's going to be a retention issue.
I was having a conversation with a compensation committee chair just yesterday who is new to the role, not new to the committee, but new to the chair role. And we were just kind of doing a debrief of, is there anything we want to do differently, anything we want to think about? And he was talking about how they feel some pressure around the broader human capital areas that they have oversight of, and told what I thought was a really interesting story. He's like, Greg, you remember from a few years ago when we were doing CEO succession and we had an internal candidate, and the person, almost made it across the finish line to being the next CEO. But in a series of board meetings leading up to that decision, just, the way this person handled themselves, the way they communicated, they did some 360 feedback, what they heard from direct reports, it was so counter to just the culture and the feel of the company. And this company was not new to CEO succession. They had already done two, over a 15-year period. But, it was just kind of retelling the story in terms of we were so close to making what could have been a really bad decision for the organization, almost exclusively because it just wasn't a good fit for their culture.
Yeah, that's super important. And, again, as a board member, what can you do? I mean, sometimes it's not going to happen in the board meeting or the comp committee meeting. You have to talk to people after the meeting, or just be invited to some of the company events to get a feel for what is that culture and what is the place all about. And then, if you're not feeling like it's really delved into at a deep enough level, you can ask as a board member, we'd like to know more about your culture. Like, where are you taking it? Is it a performance-based, what is making it such a great place to work? That is important information for any committee these days. And if you don't have that information, you should be asking, because
one of my CEOs routinely invites board members each year, different board members, to attend the annual leadership meeting where people come from all over the world. Right. And then we report out about the experience, and it's very helpful. And that's where you can see, yes, in this particular case, yes, it's working. We could see if it wasn't as well.
Absolutely.
What about the impact of remote work? A lot of companies are still remote or they're hybrid, and you read stories that makes it harder to kind of protect or grow the culture of the company because you got this distributed workforce. Any lessons learned there?
Yes. Well, first of all, there's a lot going on there right now, as we all know. I mean, every company is still working this out. The reality is, even if you're hybrid, this whole idea of connection, like, we need to make sure our people are connected at all levels. If we just think about the senior team, right? Is that team connected? I can't tell you how many times over the last year I've met with a senior team in some sort of capacity, either facilitating a team meeting or helping them with some process they're working on. And when they came together physically, maybe for the first time or sometime, they hadn't met in months, it is so transformational. It is unbelievable. And, we say this is sort of obvious. Why? People actually do need to get together. But for leading and managing today, you got to keep your eye on the ball here. We're still, pretty remote, a lot of people, even though you might be going in the office a day or two. How are you making that extra effort to ensure people are connected, even at the top? I hear a lot of stories of CEOs, the direct reports of CEOs these days saying, I love my CEO, they're great. I wish we just had a little more time together. I wish we had, I'd get a little more connection there. And it's because there's some comfort that we've all, decided is okay with sitting in our home offices. And more and more, though, people are realizing they just have to get together.
Let's go to the next page.
So this is pretty obvious. And, the idea of leaders have a real impact. And there are so many studies done from years ago that show that first line supervisors have the strongest impact on whether or not someone will be retained. And this is no different at the top. So if you have a CEO who is an amazing leader and manager and really knows how to connect with, communicate with, motivate, inspire their people, you're in good shape. But this is a tall order sometimes, and everyone has different styles. So making sure that leaders are really the ones holding on to their people and making sure that people see there's a reason to stick around, that they're valued, that people care about them. I mean, just basic, do I feel like people care about me at the workplace? Sounds like, you think at the very top, oh, it's not an issue. It can be an issue. So some of the most basic reasons I've heard why people leave, it's, I didn't think they valued me enough. I mean, that is a frequently cited statement, and it's like, wow. And then often the CEO can say, well, no, they're wonderful. I've rated them, the top rating every year. I don't understand. Well, maybe you didn't have enough of those deep, good conversations that really send the message home. So this is super important. Are we helping our people to be successful? Are we setting the tone? Are we helping them understand how valuable they are and that they're part of the team?
Susan, just a quick story there. When I was at Southwest and we were growing very, very rapidly, we started to kind of lose some of our culture, and retention became a big issue. This was in the 90s when the dot-com boom was happening, but we've solved the problem. It's a long story and lots of trial and error by investing a lot in first line supervisor recruitment and development, all taught by management and senior leaders who were also developed to teach the leaders. So it was a teaching program where leaders taught leaders. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just one and done. There was a refresh every couple of years, and it kept everyone involved, talking about these issues, thinking about these issues, and it made it a way of life. And I think it was a key to why we had great great low turnover.
Right. And when you hear, if you're at this goes back to as a board member, as a director on the comp committee, if you hear people say things like, I would work for so-and-so anywhere, I will follow them anywhere. And I often hear this in consulting to executives. They'll, admit that I'm here because of so-and-so. You have that ability to have a real followership. That's what we're hoping for. That's what you need. But we all know at the very top, things can get very intense on a senior team. And people who are valued can sometimes become disengaged because either, the top leader doesn't believe that they need to pay as much attention to them, or, that we're all big boys and girls, so we don't need to be focused on or developed. And that's a mistake. Just assume we're all still human, even at the highest levels in a company, and we still need those basic things from our boss, even though they're the CEO. So
it's funny, Susan, a few years ago, I worked with a company that was going through CEO succession. They had 2 internal candidates. They had put them through assessments. And I'll never forget this term that they used, because one of the candidates who was the leading candidate, the scores for this person on the assessment were so strong around just their understanding of the industry, their understanding of the business, their financial acumen. Everything was A+, A+, A+. And then came this term that was in this report on this person that said they're too efficient with human beings. Meaning, just didn't give anybody enough time. They always knew the answer before the people he or she was meeting with, didn't bring people along into the process. And I'll just never forget that. And that person ended up not getting the job, because that's hard to teach, is to make people understand that it's important to invest in people and bring them along into these solutions. It's not just a command and control at the top.
No, absolutely. And I've actually managed some situations like this with large organizations where when you're down to those 2 candidates and for CEO, and one has the full package in that they're technically capable, but they know how to relate to people, and they know, they're trusted, they're authentic. And then you have one that's brilliant, but people are scared to death of them, or they don't trust them. That's they don't usually win the CEO contest.
Yep.
At least anymore. Maybe 30 years ago, they might have won it. I think the pendulum has really moved more to you have to have those relationship skills to be an excellent CEO and to hold on to people.
That's great. So move on to our last slide of this section here.
Yeah, I mean, this one is, obvious, but it's like, do you invest in your people? And some of this is just having the right conversations initially at the top. Is the CEO, is the whole senior team having the kinds of conversations with their direct reports about, hey, what are you trying to do in your career? How can we help you? Let's look at your long-term career, and maybe we want to rotate your job to make sure you can move faster. Maybe you need a coach, whatever it is. But the idea of we're willing to invest in you, I think, is a powerful message today, especially. It's kind of a post-COVID need I've seen risen over the last year, where people are kind of thirsty for learning and moving ahead and questioning, where am I going to take my career, especially the top 2-3 layers of leadership. So this requires attention. And as a board member, as a comp committee member, I think you need to be asking the questions about how are you investing in your talent? What specifically are you doing for your top team to make them feel valued and to frankly accelerate their development? And sometimes it's not as much as it should be, right? If you're not hearing anything about it, that's obviously a sign. But it's part of the purview for the comp committee now to be looking more deeply at this. So you have the right to ask the questions around, are you investing in your people, and what exactly are you doing, and how can we as a comp committee maybe help you think that through?
I might have some sample bias here, but I work with a few companies that are backed by private equity firms, and they're not, small startups. These are big industrial conglomerates. Maybe they're trying to roll up an industry. And I got to tell you, I've been impressed with the level of focus that the private equity firms have on talent and talent development. They are very quick to look at the sort of these heat maps of, who's next up and who's doing what in what job. And, during compensation committee meetings, they're very vocal about what can we get this person another opportunity? This person that's been doing deals for us, is there anything that we could put them into in finance to give them that experience? This person who's been in finance, who's killing it, who we love, is there an operational role that we could give this person to kind of round out their development, because we see this person long-term as a CEO successor candidate? So those kinds of conversations, just tangible, real discussions about people on the team and what's the next great opportunity we can give them, that is hugely retentive to these people, because other organizations just aren't giving them those broader opportunities.
Right. And, you got to watch out for CEOs who have pegged people in roles. Long serving CEOs, sometimes, they've set the tone of, this is how we're running things, and we don't cross geographies, or we don't do this. And it becomes stifling, because it's like, okay, I guess that's just how things are done around here. But you have to be careful, because over time, you may have wonderful people, you may have a wonderful culture, but if they don't see like they're going anywhere, they might be like, I'm forced to go elsewhere because I don't see a path. So important, very important to be thinking about how do we, and you can be creative about this too. How do we invest in our people? It doesn't have to be all of the typical things. It could be, maybe we have them go through some really interesting meditation education session, or what is it that they need to do to grow. But important that committees are aware of this and asking, what's going on.
All right, so now we're going to roll into a few pages here on compensation. I'm going to try to change some minds, right? Because we only had 11% of people who highlighted compensation as an important lever here. And what I'm not going to talk about really is any kind of special equity grants or stay pay programs. I'm going to try to make a case for the more sort of proactive things that you can do around compensation to enhance executive retention. And so here, again, the point is that, things you do to the core compensation program are often more proactive and really can create powerful retention incentives. So don't get locked into this notion that we have to wait until someone's about to leave and then offer them some supplemental pay. I think if we think about the pay strategy and philosophy you have, how are we defining the market for talent when we do benchmarking? Are we thinking far enough ahead because we're a growth company and we want people that have been there, done that? Maybe we need to stretch a little bit on the philosophy and the strategy around pay. Are we creating incentive plan designs that have line of sight and control and are, rewarding and people feel motivated by, right? Because everybody wants to hopefully stay in an environment where they have the ability to earn good compensation for producing great results. So again, there's a lot of things I think that just the core comp plan, what I'm suggesting is just every once in a while, you take a step back and you look at the comp program that you have in place through the lens of retention, just like we have to do every year for public companies from a risk perspective, right? We don't design comp plans necessarily by focusing on risk, but at least once a year, we kind of take a step back and we say, okay, is there anything that we're doing here that would cause someone to take excessive risk that could materially harm the company? That's a chartered, annual responsibility for a committee. Here I'm saying maybe you take a step back once a year and say, let's do that exact process, but let's use the lens of retention. And I'll give you some examples. Sometimes, believe it or not, we see, really onerous stockholding requirements, right? And maybe we did it to appease, the proxy advisory firms, or maybe at the time it was, viewed as a good practice. But sometimes if it's really onerous or well beyond, competitive practice or proxy advisory firm policies, that can be an irritant for executives, that they can't monetize any of the equity that they're getting as a form of compensation because you've got hold till retirement or hold 3 years post vesting, or you have something that's a little out of bounds. This is a weird one to talk about, but sometimes low severance can be a retention problem. I know it seems weird to talk about severance and retention in the same sentence, but sometimes I've seen people leave because they're worried about the potential for job loss and they don't feel like they have adequate protection. So it's a bird in the hand, one in the bush kind of issue where they're going to leave to go get safety because they don't feel like there's enough protection, in the event, let's say the company is on, rocky soil and, there's some anxiety about it. They just want to know that they're going to be protected in the event that perhaps there's a change of control and, they might lose their role. So even something like severance, looking at it from the perspective of retention, sometimes there are enhancements there that you can make. And I mentioned again, this market definition. If you're a $2 billion company on your way to being a $10 billion company and all the benchmarking you're doing is looking at $2 billion companies, you might lose people to organizations that are willing to pay a little more because they're focusing on where they're going to be 2 or 3 years from now versus where they are. So again, before you get to the point of having to do supplemental equity grants or stay bonus, programs, really just take a step back, look at your overall core executive compensation program through the lens of risk and see if there's any tweaks that you might make to improve.
Greg, I think it's good when you're going through your succession planning exercise to look at everybody you have as potential successors and see what you have on the table for them that's holding them and retentive, because that might be a good time to do career shares for people who they've already vested in a lot of options or whatever, and you want to make sure they have something to keep them there.
Yeah, I think having that notion that are we doing everything we can from a compensation standpoint to create those kinds of hooks or retention mechanisms, is smart. And because you're doing them as part of your strategy, right? We know we want to be competitive. We know we want to align pay and performance, and we need to have another pillar that says we know we want our program to be retentive. We want to hang on to our best people. What are we doing to attack that objective while simultaneously achieving the objective of being competitive on pay and having strong alignment between pay and performance? So again, if that's not an angle or an objective to your core philosophy, maybe it should be, so that you could consider something like a career share, which there's different definitions out there. Some of them are just, shares that vest after a relatively long period of time, 10, 15 years. There's some companies that do it that they only vest upon retirement or after retirement. So again, the only way you would end up with something like that in your program, I think, is if one of your stated objectives that you're trying to achieve through compensation is to make the program retentive for your best talent. The next thing I wanted to mention, in addition to just strengthening the core, is that I do think that just good old basic effective pay and performance alignment can actually be a more effective retention mechanism than stay pay. And here's what I mean by that. I think you want an organization where people are excited to stay. They're excited and rewarded to stay, as opposed to you just making it expensive for them to leave. Okay, so a lot of retention programs are really aimed more at just making it expensive for them to leave. Oh my gosh, I'm leaving so much value on the table, I couldn't possibly leave. That's okay, but I think it's better if you create an incentive structure that, again, makes it really exciting and rewarding for people to stay. You know, fixed compensation can work, but I'm telling you, good, strong variable compensation also can work in terms of keeping people in the seat. Because again, people want to feel fairly rewarded for their effort and their contribution. And again, I think you can do it through incentives. When I give you some examples around, making sure that there's line of sight between the metrics that you're using and, the people that are tied to those metrics. I think making sure that you have reasonable goals or performance targets is part of this equation, right? So that they feel like there's a better than not chance that they can actually earn the incentive compensation that's out in front of them. I think something like having strong upside earning opportunity, right? Maybe it's, for those comp gurus out there, it's, a kinked curve where there's a higher sharing ratio, above target than there is below target. Or maybe you go to a 300% of target as a cap instead of the traditional 200 or 150. So, how can we really create an incentive structure that is going to make people feel motivated and rewarded? Those people are going to stay, right? Because they know exactly what they have to do to earn premium pay. And I think that's a better solution than just putting fixed compensation out there in the future, again, which is a little more focused, in my view, on making it painful for them to leave as opposed to excited about staying. And then sort of the last thing I wanted to talk about on the compensation front was, and Libby mentioned this just a minute ago, is having maybe a little more balance between how we think about external competitiveness and internal equity. And that, pay progression is something that should be top of mind for compensation committees for people that have real upside with the organization. So again, instead of, saying, look, this is the job you're in today, and this is how that job pays, and here's what we're going to pay you. That works okay when you're new in position, but as you have opportunities for advancement, I think you have to start thinking about how do we manage this person over time to get them from the job they're in today to the job they might be headed to in the future. And to me, that's just it's a nuance, but it's important, because if you're a COO and we're always going to pay you like a COO, and we have all the market data that tells us what a COO makes, if you're in the CEO succession camp, you just might not be around when we get ready to make you CEO. We got to start earlier migrating that individual's pay from a COO, in my example, to closer to CEO pay in an intentional, thoughtful way over a defined period of time. And, again, that's just sort of shifting the balance, because, over-reliance on market data is for jobs, and comp committees have a harder job. You don't pay jobs, you pay people. So you really have to think about the person and where they're heading and what to do with their compensation. It can't just always be looking outside for similar jobs at similar companies and knowing what they pay. So again, from a compensation standpoint, I'd say, really rethinking the core program before you get to supplemental. I think making sure that you're making it exciting and rewarding for your high performers to stay, right? Differentiated pay for differentiated performance, and managing their compensation intentionally based on their career development and progression, not always just rotely against, a market rate of pay for the job that they're in. Okay. So a few quicker hits, because I know we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Just a few quicker hits here on the communication strategies. This one is so easy, right? Just make sure that your leaders understand the totality of their compensation and benefits package. We do a lot of interviews with executives, and we're focusing more on trying to learn about the business and the strategy and the key milestones and the metrics and all that good stuff. But we also ask them about compensation, and it's probably 60% of the time they don't do a very good job of describing their own compensation plan, which is a real miss, right? So these kinds of communication levers that you have, this is where you get the ROI out of all the hard work, right? All the thinking around strategy, all the thinking around metrics, all the thinking around competitiveness. You're not going to get a return on any of that investment if the people who are on these plans don't understand how they work. So really just hammering this notion of, make sure they understand. Tally sheets is a tactic, right? That's a format that allows an executive to see the totality of his or her compensation on one sheet of paper over a period of time. It can be hugely impactful because they don't think of it that way all day like we do who are in the business. And so again, making sure they understand what they have and how it works can really, really energize the comp plan beyond just the design itself. And then the next thing on communication, I've seen this again, time and time again. We sort of condition executives. I think in some cases we condition compensation committees to always be focusing on what we call target pay, right? What's my base? What's my target bonus? What's my target equity grant every year? It's target, 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 target. When we do benchmarking, it's target. But there's another definition of pay that is hugely important, whether you call it realizable pay or actual pay. There's all types of words for it. But showing executives what they're actually getting paid, as opposed to constantly talking about their target pay, can really be impactful. I'll give you an example. We had a company we were working with, they're like 15 billion in revenue, high performing company, great CEO. Board starts to get worried that bigger companies might come in and go after this CEO to be their CEO, maybe companies even twice their size. So we looked at some benchmarking of $30 billion companies in the same industry versus 15 billion and saw the delta in target pay. It really wasn't that great. It was maybe 15 to 20% more in target pay, but sometimes that's enough, to make somebody make a move. But when we looked at the realizable pay of the CEO in the $15 million business, his compensation had been 5 to 6 times his target pay consistently over a 6 to 8 year period, because their bonus was paying out well, because their performance was good. They have a high percentage of PSUs in their long-term incentive plan. They were earning those near max. The stock price performance of this company was astronomical. So when you factor it all in and you add it all up, the actual compensation being delivered, this realizable pay notion, was again a 5 or 6 times factor over the target pay. And the CEO had no visibility into that until the analysis was done and shared with them. So now you've got people making bad decisions on bad data, right? Because they're like, wow, they're going to give me a 20% pay increase. We're like, are they? Because look at what you've actually been getting paid here because of the performance that you've been delivering. That's a different equation. That's how we want our CEOs and our senior executives thinking about pay. When they think about a competitor or another company they might go to work for, what is the pay opportunity there based on the performance trajectory of the business and my ability to impact that performance trajectory? So again, it's a slight change in communication from target to realizable, but boy, it can have a big impact on retention. And then I know, Susan, we had talked about this, and Libby as well, this notion that just part of communicating is actually listening, right, and responding. And I think you had examples earlier where sometimes it just feels so good, right, to know that you've been heard and that action was taken, right, in response to your concern. So again, pretty basic stuff here, but don't underestimate the power of listening and responding to have an impact on executive retention.
I think I told you all the story of one time we did some retention bonuses. We sat down with the execs and said, we really want to retain you, and so we're giving you the bonus. And I was head of HR at that time, and people came to me and said what meant more to them than the money was someone said, we want to retain you, you're a keeper. And that just meant No one had ever told them that before, and it meant a lot.
That's
Yeah,
great.
that says it all, really. I mean, it's interesting, the power, the combination of both. It's if they feel the love, if you will, but you also are actually rewarding them. So the 1-2 is pretty powerful.
Mhm.
So if we turn the page, we want to get to our last polling question real quick, but before that, again, just this holistic model, just to sum it up again, we think if you're thinking about an issue like retention, we're just encouraging you to have a broader view. Now that aligns well with the purview of the compensation committee to say, look, if we really want to address retention, let's not just think about it as a compensation problem or as a leadership problem or as a communication problem. Let's think holistically about all the levers that are at our disposal and then kind of move those levers based on your facts and circumstances to produce the best result, right? That's the message. So in our last question, we want to go back to one of the first questions we asked you, get a quick poll here because I know we want to have time for Q&A, but now that we've gone through the different sections, if once again, you could just let us know whether you think the most impactful area here to retention is leadership, compensation, communication, or if maybe you would change your mind and say all of the above. If we could just do a quick poll, submit your responses, we can get the answers up quickly, and then we'll move into Q&A.
We have some questions already on the chat that I'll throw out when we get there, but others can send their questions on the chat as well.
Excellent.
And as a reminder, in the first poll on this topic, we had 68% of people that said leadership. We had 11% on compensation, and we had 21% on communication. We'll see if we're going to get a different result because we gave you a fourth choice here. But other than that, we'll see if we've skewed the feelings here at all. I don't know if we have any questions we can address while we're waiting for the polling question to come in or the responses to come in.
Sure. One of the questions that you touched on a little bit, but I think delving into it a little bit more would be good. When there's a company in crisis, that's usually when you can be very vulnerable to losing an executive. And so what do you put into play during that time when a company's in crisis to make sure that you're retaining your team at the top that you need to work your way through that crisis?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, from a leadership perspective, if you're a board member and if there is a crisis in the organization, the biggest thing you want to have happen is, where are the anchors of stability? What can we point to and say, this is stable, this isn't changing? Or how do you, as board members, personally reach out to some of your management team members if it was a CEO problem, let's say, or if there's something going on at the top, there can be a way to stabilize those around the table and make sure that they realize they're valued and it's worth hanging around. And, so you have to be the adult in the room sometimes. And that's, you don't want to have to go there as a board member, but sometimes you do if there's a crisis and it requires the board's attention in that capacity. Other times you just hope the CEO has a game plan and you can help them formulate that game plan on how they're going to shore up and ensure people are feeling like it's okay to stay. So from the leadership side, clearly it's why is it going to be okay here going forward? What's in it for me? Am I valued? Is this still the same place? And then there's clearly, Greg, from a compensation side, I would think there's things you can do there as well.
Yeah, I was going to say crisis situations are probably the one case where you might have to jump right to supplemental type programs, because especially if it's an external shock, right? We might have to file bankruptcy. Something's, really going on here where we're putting the company up for sale. Those are all things that you can't really go back to basics and look at the core comp plan and hope to work your way out of it. You're probably going to have to be in the land of offering some real short-term focused incentives to get people to stay through a very difficult period of time. And we do have the poll results now. It's because of the way we asked the questions. I must admit, we may have steered the audience here because
I think so.
we have 80% of people that have said all of the above. Now, we're going to take that as we were so convincing that it is a holistic solution that we've moved a lot of minds, when in reality, 80% of people might have chosen that answer if we had it as a choice in the first polling question. We'll acknowledge that, but we're gonna assume it's the former, that we really changed the minds today, and has an appreciation for the fact that it's a more holistic strategy if we really want to do a good job at executive retention.
Well, just to tie up that last question, I was on the board of a company one time that someone made an offer to buy us, and we weren't sure whether we were going to sell or not, but we needed to lock in our management team because if we didn't sell, we needed them to be there. And so we used that retention program or that severance program to lock them in. And at the end of the day, the company was sold, but it was worth their while to stay, and they wanted to change the leadership team anyway. So, but it worked out well. I didn't feel guilty for where people ended up. Everybody got a great new job, and they got paid well just for sticking it through. So I think that worked. Another question that was on there, and it kind of leads into one that I had, is some of the things you do for people at the lower level, like moving people through their jobs, or those kind of quality of life or work design issues, don't necessarily work for the CEO or the very senior leaders. How do you get, listen to their specific needs and figure out what keeps them in their seat beyond just the money?
Well, I mean, I think clearly if this is a senior team and of generally ambitious people, you have to go to the heart of, what are they trying to achieve? What excites them? What do they want to be doing at that company? And where do they want to end up? I think that often is the biggest sweet spot, if you will, for focusing on retaining from a leadership perspective. But there are some basic things too at the top. I mean, I've often been blown away by just, if an individual who reports to a CEO does not feel quote unquote valued by that CEO at a certain level, over time, they will probably leave, because especially if they have other places and they're a highly prized executive who could be working for another organization, it's somebody else looks like they're going to care about me a lot more and they think I'm wonderful and they're going to pay, the pay could be the same or better, but it's often, is it exciting? Does it look like something where my talents can really be put to great use and I'll be valued? That's sort of the number one.
And with the oversell, the generational shift, but there's just a lot going on. I think that when you think about just having a mission that your employees are connected to, having values that you actually live, right? It's tangible. So some of the things, Susan, you talked about earlier around culture, I mean, to me at lower levels, that's a big part of the equation, is just making people feel connected to your broader purpose as an organization can really help not only retain people, but recruit people to your business. These are the kinds of companies that folks want to work for these days.
Yeah. And the culture piece is the one that is taking the hit right now across the board, because it's hard to hold cultures together when you're not as connected.
Well, and then the one thing not to forget, when you're on the board, you're having the CEO feel valued and listened to is just as important as the executives feeling valued by the CEO. And I know I've been on 2 boards where we have had lengthy discussions about quality of life issues for our CEO, whether it's travel that's taking a toll on him or her. Can we provide net jet service or better options for travel? Or could we get a driver to make the commute easier? Things that, aren't compensation, but could make the executive's life easy. So don't forget those kinds of things. And then just asking the CEO, would this make your life easier? And would you appreciate it? In some cases, they say no. The one where we wanted to get the driver, she did not want a driver, but we tried.
Right. And I would also say for the rest of the management team, as board members, it's really important to get a feel for how are they feeling. The CEO may be setting the tone, but is it a tone that's working, or is it a tone that's alienating? That's always important to just get a feel for how is that playing across the team, and do they feel good about it?
Well, I think we are right at the point where we need to wrap up. And Mary, do you have some closing housekeeping tips?
Thank you so much, Libby. If we move to the next slide, I just want to take a moment, everyone, to thank Libby, Greg, and Susan, who joined us today and who joined you all to provide you this really insightful information. I know we only had a couple of questions that we were able to get to, but if you submitted a question to the panel and it was not answered, please know that we will follow up with you via email. I have a couple of quick just reminders for you just before we conclude the program. First, again, you can find archives of all of our previous webinars, and this webinar will be there in about a week on our nacdonline.org/webinars and on pearlmeyer.com/knowledge-share. I also want to note that our next compensation series webinar is going to be taking place on June 29th at 2 p.m. Keep a lookout on our events page to be able to register. It will also be complimentary, and so we are looking to do that. We're going to have that page up soon for registration. If we move to the next slide, I want to remind everyone that if you stayed with us this entire time, you'll receive the 1 credit towards maintaining your NACD fellowship or certification just by participating. If you have any questions about either program, visit us online on nacdonline.org or contact us using the information that you see here. And finally, last slide. I, again, just thank you everyone for participating, for joining us this afternoon, and to our panel for this amazing presentation. Before you go, team, remember the evaluation questions are going to pop up. Please feel free to go ahead and fill that out. It's really quick, or it'll also be in an email that goes out this afternoon. I know you all are busy, so we just really appreciate the feedback, and it helps us for future webinars. So that's it for our program. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.